Then God said to Abraham, "Regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah, and I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants." Then Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. "How could I become a father at the age of 100?" he thought. "And how can Sarah have a baby when she is 90 years old?" So Abraham said to God, "May Ishmael live under your special blessing."
But God replied, "No, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. As for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you have asked. I will make him extremely fruitful and multiply his descendants. He will become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year." When God had finished speaking, he left Abraham.
The Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My Lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." "All right," they said. "Do as you have said." So Abraham ran back to the tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and the roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees.
"Where is Sarah, your wife?" the visitors asked. "She's inside the tent," Abraham replied. Then one of them said, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son." Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, "How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially when my master, my husband, is also so old?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, 'Can an old woman like me have a baby?' Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh." But the Lord said, "No, you did laugh." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
A great deal of life consists of calculating probabilities. On a daily, hourly, oftentimes minute-by-minute basis, we make decisions based upon what our past experiences declare to us as probable or improbable. Your getting in a car this morning and driving 60 miles an hour to church was based on probabilities, even if you made those decisions on a subconscious level. Your going to lunch after worship today is based on the probability that you can trust the cooking of some chef in some restaurant whom you've never met. Your investments in the market are based largely on long-term projections and long-term goals. In other words, probabilities. The 10 lottery tickets you bought Friday night, or your Methodist friend bought Friday night, are a decision based largely on probability or improbability. When you sit before a doctor who's about to slice your innards, and the doctor says, there's there's a 15% chance we're talking about probability. And all you attorneys in the room spend a great deal of your time trying to build a case for probable cause. And this doesn't even count the weatherman, whose entire vocation is based upon probability and improbability. Let's be honest, a great deal of life is playing the odds. Life is sort of like a poker game. You've got the hand you're dealt, and what you do with that hand from that point on is based upon what you perceive the odds to be. Only you're not playing for chips or cash, you're playing for life. We cast ourselves into the contingencies of life and do the best we can with the odds we have. And most of the time, we live within the parameters of the probable, and we call that reality. But every now and then, someone dares to imagine outside of the probable. And then they decide to think outside the probable. And then they decide to pray outside the probable. And before long, they are living outside of the parameters of the probable. I think about Magellan, Columbus, De Soto, sailing across the seas out beyond what any of their maps could plot in those days. Out beyond where any person of their like had ever been. We know the full scope of the world today only because some people were willing to go out beyond what anybody in their day knew or could know. I think about the Wright brothers drawing skeptical and cynical crowds out to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where they were trying to build airplanes. They were doing it in a day where driving on the ground was still pretty rudimentary. And these guys are trying to put something in the air, and crowds gathered. Until one day, one of them actually took off. And the crowd of skeptics became a crowd of eyewitnesses. Did you see that? I think about the day Neil Armstrong put his foot in the moon dust and said, "This is one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind." A little over half a century earlier, the primary means of transportation in our culture were horse and buggy. Think about that. And a little over half a century later, there was an American on the moon. Occasionally, we stumble onto something, discover something, experience something out beyond the parameters of the possible. And it redefines reality for all of us. In Genesis 17, God says to Abraham, "You and Sarah." Did you hear that? Up to this point, it had just been you. For the first time in the story, God says, "You and Sarah are going to have a baby." Abraham found it so incredulous and unbelievable that he fell on his face laughing. In the next chapter, chapter 18, Abraham and Sarah receive 3 visitors, and they greet them with grand hospitality. And these 3 visitors declare to Abraham and Sarah that this time next year you will have a son. Sarah's in the tent working, overhears the pronouncement, and Sarah laughs, just like Abraham. God says to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh?" Sarah walks out and says, "Oh, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh." And God says, "Yeah, I heard you. You laughed. Yes, you did." It makes perfect sense why Abraham and Sarah laughed. If we're all honest with ourselves when we read this story, we all should chuckle a time or two ourselves. I mean, on the table beside their bed, Abraham and Sarah had a gallon tub of Bengay for those aching muscles at the end of every day. They had been checking into assisted living for months. They had an AARP magazine on the bathroom counter right between Abraham's false teeth and his hearing aids. Their idea of a good time was watching Lawrence Welk on Saturday nights. And they had been a part of the Sunsetters group in their church for over 45 years. They had forgotten where the nursery even was. They couldn't have found the nursery in their church if you paid them. They're too old for this stuff. And so they both got a really good laugh when God said, yeah, you're going to have a child. When Abraham finally rose from the ground and caught his breath, he said to God, "Let's just go with Ishmael. He's already here. I already have a son. Let's just go with that plan. And God says, no. I'm going to bless Ishmael, but my covenant will be with yours and Sarah's child. I can imagine, can you, Abraham and Sarah climbing in bed that night and simultaneously saying to each other, wait till you hear what God said to me today, and laughing their way to sleep. A few months ago, Greg Bryant, a communications professor at UCLA, finished a long study on laughter. He began the study with the premise that laughter is one of the most important components of human communication. In this study, he recorded numerous females laughing together. In some instances, the females were lifelong friends laughing together. And in some instances, the females were complete strangers laughing. He took these recordings all around the world with him, and he played the recordings for people across the cultural spectrum. He went to the Balkans and South America, and he even included some tribal people from Tanzania. The listeners were correct over 80% of the time, differentiating between the ladies who were best of friends and the ladies who were complete strangers, and they could tell the difference in just a few seconds of recorded laughter. All these people spoke different languages, they had different customs. But it seems that laughter is something of a universal language. Everyone understands it. Some people say that laughter takes us back to our evolutionary roots. If you listen to some people when they laugh, it sounds like something you'd hear in the jungle somewhere. Their body jerks and they make all kinds of noise and they try to cover it up, cover their mouth up when they laugh. It's an ancient form of communication. Some people say laughter is older than words. Laughter arises from the central part of our being. Have you ever noticed that? Laughter happens when muscles around our rib cage compress air and push it out, which is why we find it so difficult to talk when we're laughing. Even as laughter makes noise, it sort of silences noise as well. And it has control of our body in some ways. When you're laughing, are you controlling the laughter, or is the laughter controlling you? It's also true that laughter is largely a communal corporate phenomenon. Did you know that you're 30 times more likely to laugh when you're in the presence of another person than when you're all by yourself? You're 30 times more likely to laugh when you're with someone else. Laughter's contagious in that way. You see someone else laughing and you can't help but laugh. Laughter is a result of another's company. I have my days when I wonder if we laugh enough when we read the Bible. Like here, when God tells Abraham and Sarah that they're going to be in the maternity ward instead of the geriatric ward, part of me thinks we should be on the floor laughing with Abraham and Sarah. But then in the middle of their laughter, God says to them, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" Is anything too difficult for the Lord? This question revisits itself to the avid Bible reader. Read the Bible long enough and you'll be challenged to recalculate the probabilities and reimagine the possibilities. Like when the people of Israel stood on the shores of the Red Sea with the mighty Egyptian army closing in behind, rocking a hard place if there ever was one. And suddenly the seas parted and they walked across on dry ground. You remember that? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Or when little boy David stood in the middle of the battlefield, the Philistine army on this side, the Israelite army on this side, both sides in silence because they can't believe what they've seen. And suddenly little boy David lifts up the head of Goliath the giant. Or when the people of Israel were marched off into exile, their temple destroyed, priesthood no more, Jerusalem was in an ash heap. Do we have a future? Are we going to be a people anymore? And the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 32 asked them the question, is anything too difficult for the Lord? Or when Daniel was thrown in the lion's den and suddenly the lions became vegetarians. Or when Gabriel came to Mary and said, "Congratulations." And she said, "You don't understand. This is impossible." And Gabriel said, "Well, Mary, with God, all things are possible." Or in Matthew 17, when the disciples came to a demoniac and couldn't cast out the demons, but Jesus did so. And the disciples said, "How did you do that?" And Jesus said to them, "If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible." Or when Jesus said to His disciples, "It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." And they said, "Who then can be saved?" And Jesus said, "With God, all things are possible." God can thread a camel. Or the women who showed up at the tomb, pretty sure of the probability they would find there. Talk about the odds. And what they discovered was a walking, talking impossibility. Over and over and over again, the Bible tells stories of events that aren't reasonable, they aren't calculable, they aren't probable. They're stories that shatter our views of reality. Over and over again, the Bible asks the question of us, is anything too difficult for the Lord? Now, I want to be crystal clear today. I'm not advocating today for some casual triumphalism that says all things are possible, just believe. Mail in $12 to Preston Clegg Ministries and your life will open up with unimaginable possibilities. That's not it. In fact, I've been reminded this week of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who prayed, "Father, all things are possible for you. Yet, it's not what I want. It's what you want." I'm not saying today that all things are possible. Okay? I'm not saying that all things are possible. I'm saying that with God, all things are possible. In chapter 17, just before Abraham fell on his face laughing, he falls on his face one more time. It says in verse 3 of chapter 17 that Abraham fell on his face before the Lord, presumably to worship God as God. And in the end, isn't that what changes the game for all of us? I mean, there is not one thing about you or about me that is infinite. Each of us has very limited bounds and possibilities. We have limited capabilities, each of us, all of us. I can't do all things and neither can you. Our wombs have biological clocks. We have limited capacities for reason. We have limited capacities for love, time, space, strength. You can calculate our probabilities. You can reason out our possibilities. We're limited. But the moment God enters the equation, if God is an eighth of whom we worship Him to be, the moment God enters the equation, the moment one becomes a friend of God, the moment one bows her knee to pray to the God of the universe, then how do you calculate probabilities and possibilities? You can't measure the infinite. And how much does the eternal care about biological clocks? The moment one believes in God, she redefines the possible. Horizons expand. The future approaches. Calculators falter. The moment one drops to his knees to pray, he is communing with the eternal and the immeasurable. Many people in this world believe that life is calculable, unalterable, predictable. But those are not the people who worship the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Believing in that God demands an openness to surprise and mystery. Brothers and sisters, there are days I read stories like this and I'm tempted to say, well, that was back in the good old days when things like that happened. Miracles happened back then, you know. But we know better today, don't we? Maybe we know worse today. Maybe we know worse today because we don't know what we don't know. We've gotten so good at the probable, there's no room for surprise. We've shrunk all reality down to what can be explained and controlled. But if there is any group of people on the planet who should be able to differentiate between the probable and the possible, it should be the people of God. If there is any group of people who believe that God has a future for us that is not just more of the same than that we already know, it should be the people of God. If there is any group of people who should be slow to say the word impossible, it's the people of God. If there's any people on the planet who should be drunk with hope, it is the people of God. Jesus said, faith the size of a mustard seed could move a mountain, presumably because only those with so much as a seed of faith would try to speak to that mountain in the first place. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Can I ask you this morning in the depths of your soul, do you believe that God is in this with us? Really, honestly, with yourself. Do you believe God is in this with us? Even in our dry and barren days, where racism prevails and sexism still with us, where entire masses of people are on the move because of violence and oppression, where life is so very cheap, when people despair because they cannot imagine that a barren present could give way to a pregnant future. Do you believe that God is with us in the middle of it all? Really? Do you believe that? I ask today, honestly, because you're 30 times more likely to laugh when you're in the presence of another. If you believe that God is in it with us, then we are no longer bound by the probable. If you believe it, then we dare not judge God's future by our past. If so, if you believe it, then we ought not to be quick to say the word impossible. Over and over again in my life, I've told God, that's impossible. And God has laughed at me and said, I don't play the odds, I create the odds. And when God does the impossible, we dare not laugh. I don't know, maybe we should laugh. Maybe we should roll on the floor with Abraham and Sarah. After all, laughter silences all our words. No more thinking and rationalization and theologizing, just laughter. I don't know whether we should laugh or not, but I do know this. The only people who will be around to see the impossible are those who believed just enough to dream it, to imagine it, or to pray it in the first place. About 9 months after Abraham and Sarah finished laughing, Sarah gave birth to a son. And there those two old folks stood over the crib looking into his eyes, the day they never thought would come. Incredible, wonderful. Abraham leaned over to Sarah by the crib. What should we call him? And Sarah thought for a moment and she looked at him and she said, He looks like an Isaac to me. Do you know what the word Isaac means in Hebrew? The name Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And that night, an old barren couple looked into the eyes of laughter and saw their future, their impossible future. Something tells me that when God looked down at that couple and their child that evening, that God laughed a little too. And so maybe in the end, we either laugh at God or we learn to laugh with Him. Amen.